Hello, everyone. Great to have you back for another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, a pleasure to see you. Great to have you on the show again.
And it's great to be with you again, as always, Nasim. Thank you.
Yeah, Mouin, so I wanted to begin with the big story, of course, the recognition of the state of Palestine by a number of G7 member states, UK, Canada. And then we look at the ramifications, if there are any of that, why now? I have a number of questions around that topic. And then I want to move to developments in Gaza. There's a Trump initiative um, to end, well, day after plan for what would happen in Gaza. There was a meeting last week with Blair and a number of others. And today, Tuesday, the 23rd, I think he's presenting, he's having a meeting with a number of Arab countries on the side of the UN General Assembly meeting. And then we'll discuss the importance of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan alliance, which some claim is a result of Israel's attack in Doha. Arab countries, Gulf countries looking at other alternatives for security. So we'll discuss that and move on to some of the other wider issues. But let's begin, as I mentioned, with the recognition of Palestine, the state of Palestine. Uh, so UK, Canada, Australia, a number of others joined the overwhelming majority of the international community. 193 UN member states, of them some 75, 80% recognize the state of Palestine. Now the UK, which should have been the first because many would say owes a historical debt to the Palestinians for having planted the seeds of the genocide in Gaza now. So why now, and what difference does it make, if any?
Yeah, as you mentioned, most of the international community did this a long time ago. Just to remind ourselves, the Palestine Liberation Organization declared the state of Palestine on the 15th of November, 1988. So in the last century, most of the international community recognized the state of Palestine already during the late 1980s. A number of others have done so in the intervening years, but until last year, with the sole exception of Sweden, not a single Western state had recognized the state of Palestine. And then that began to change. Last year, we had Norway, Ireland, and Spain recognizing Palestinian statehood, and then one or two, Slovenia, and perhaps one or two others. And during the past week, in the context of this high level meeting on two-state solution, two-state settlement, or whatever it was called, held during the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, we had Britain, Canada, and Australia. In fact, they recognized Palestine just a few days previously, but now we have had France, Malta, Luxembourg, Belgium offering conditional recognition. And so, really, it's only Germany, Italy, Hungary, Finland, and a few Baltic states that are the holdouts. If six more states recognize Palestine, as many states will recognize Palestine as recognize Israel, and we will be increasingly back to the situation we had in the 1970s and 1980s, where more countries recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization than recognized Israel. But you asked a key question: what does this mean and why now? Well, different interpretations have been given to these acts of recognition. On the one hand, it's being described as a transformative game changer. On the other, as a meaningless political gesture, as symbolism that changes absolutely nothing. Um, it's it's both and neither and something else. So let me explain. the reason that these governments are now proceeding towards recognition has very little to do with their assessment of the situation in the Middle East. It has everything to do with them feeling they can no longer afford to ignore the groundswell of domestic public opinion to end their complicity with Israeli apartheid, and particularly with the Gaza genocide. So they have chosen the path of least resistance. This symbolic, performative gesture that gets a lot of media attention. That allows a Palestinian flag to be raised in their capitals and so on, but that does not entail any meaningful or concrete policy change towards Israel. And so I think the intent behind this is to divert and deflect, to try to mollify domestic public opinion by saying, "Look, we've actually done something. It's all over the headlines. Now, please put away your demonstrations and go home." But if you look at the Israeli response, it's absolute hysteria. They've been trotting out once again the Great Replacement theory, better known as the Protocols of the Elders of Mecca, that the only reason these governments are doing this is because they've been flooded with Muslim refugees who are trying to take over the world and they have to satisfy them, and similar nonsense, that these governments are now basically acting as agents of Hamas. Well, if this was a meaningless political theater, why are Israel's apologists responding with such hysteria? Well, there's a very good reason for this, because these acts of recognition, symbolic as they may be, represent the very first time since the emergence of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, the first time since the Zionist project was transformed from an aspiration to a reality by the 1917 Balfour Declaration and League of Nations mandate, that governments are coming out with measures in support of Palestinian rights, not in response to their own calculations, not out of exasperation with Israeli conduct, not in order to throw a bone to Arab governments, but rather as a direct response to pressure from their own citizens. And so, from Israel's perspective, this is a very significant and very alarming development, because it demonstrates that public pressure now can and does affect government policy, and that in contrast to previous decades, it's no longer governments responding to domestic pressure by taking increasingly pro Israeli positions, but rather they're beginning to take positions in support of Palestinian rights. And so the hysteria of the Israeli response has less to do with recognition as such, but that the dam has burst, fear of what could come next. If these public campaigns continue, if they intensify, if they are made a significant issue in elections, could that mean arms embargoes? Could that mean trade sanctions? Could that mean legal accountability and judicial measures? Is the era of Israeli impunity coming to an end, gradually, slowly, however, but coming to an end nonetheless? And I think this explains why Israel is quite right to be terrified of these acts of recognition. Again, not because of what happened, but because of why it happened and what that means about what could potentially come next. So I think, these public campaigns to end governmental complicity with the Gaza genocide and Israeli apartheid, and to replace impunity with accountability, should view this as a success and as the beginning of a journey to fundamentally change Western policies towards Israel and the Palestinians. It's all out in the open now. Everything is up for grabs. That's how I would see it.
To the end part of your answer, the the realization that the dam has burst, as you mentioned, is one of the reasons I think why you're seeing Zionist pro-Israelis seeking to take control of the information space by what is happening in the US now by the purchase of TikTok by Ellison, who is a funder of the IDF and very closely allied to Israel. I mean, if we have time, I want to speak about that later on, right at the end of our conversation. But to your point about this being symbolic, I think that is one of the most common accusation. The Europeans had probably three options. One was to stop arms sale, impose sanctions. The EU has spoken about stopping the Israel-EU association agreement, but I don't think they will have enough votes for that to pass. And the other was to recognize Palestine. But of all, this is the only of the three. This is the only one where there is no tangible act on
Precisely.
the ground. There is no arms embargo. There is
Yes.
no sanctions, which is why many think this hollow gesture doesn't really address the genocide.
No,
And UK
not at
has
all.
always, sorry, just speaking from the
Yeah,
UK point of
please.
view, Starmer, UK Prime Minister, before the election said, we will recognize Palestine at the most appropriate time. This is like the most expensive chip card we have, ace up our sleeves. We will do that once situation demands it. What demands it when if you're not using it at a time of does this situation really demand? Is this the biggest card you can play? There are other cards, which is to stop arms sales. You could have imposed sanctions on Israel, but instead of using those cards, he's just offered to give something symbolic, which is just recognition of Palestine. So on the one hand, he's offering something very, very meaningless, you can say, but on the other hand, he was talking the recognition of Palestine as being something really important. Then why use it now? It just that's the quite a baffling question.
No, that's a key point, and we have to remember the position of all these states has traditionally been that they are prepared to recognize Palestinian statehood, but only after Israel consents to the establishment of a Palestinian state in bilateral negotiations under U.S. supervision. In other words, we're prepared to do it in principle, but rest assured, it's never going to happen. Now they've done so when no one is even considering negotiations about a two-state settlement. And the only explanation for this is massive public pressure. And precisely as you said, they've chosen the path of least resistance, and they're hoping they can get away with it. And the key challenge now is to continue and to increase this public pressure on these governments so that they are compelled to adopt policies and measures that don't only result in declarations that change absolutely nothing on the ground, but that directly address the mass slaughter taking place in the Gaza Strip, that directly address the daily pogroms of dispossession and annexation and settlement expansions taking place in the West Bank, and that in the broader scheme of things, replace impunity with accountability. Now, there's also another issue, which is that I think it's generally correct that it changes absolutely nothing. But having said that, the state of Palestine is now formally recognized. So, in legal terms, if you will, it's no longer just Israel being an occupation of foreign territory and an occupation that has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice, as happened in July last year. You now have a situation that is more akin to the 1990 Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. In other words, one state that you recognize is now in full occupation and claiming total sovereignty over another state. What impact will this have on Western policy? Well, absent public pressure, none whatsoever. And this is where I think it remains the key issue. But the other point I want to make is that the states that have declared recognition have done so very clearly in the framework of, peace process, this tired slogan of a two-state settlement, and so on. So now the question becomes, well, if that's why you're doing it, what are you actually going to do about it? The key test will come if Israel obtains U.S. authorization to formally annex parts or all of the West Bank. And that will be the moment of truth for these governments, and particularly if they do not respond, if, as you suggested, they once again hide behind the European Union's refusal to take any measures and use that as an excuse not to take any bilateral measures, well, then public pressure can go in a very different direction. Basically, take your peace process, take your two-state paradigm, and take a hike. We're going to focus now on genocide, on apartheid, on annexation.
And Netanyahu, of course, responded by saying that there will never be a Palestinian state in his watch, and he's said that throughout his career. I think he said that a number of times. But this time, having recognized the state of Palestine, so countries like UK, Australia, France, are they now compelled to demonstrate that they will defend this policy? So now, for example, if Netanyahu comes back from the UN and he said he will deliver a response to the recognition of the state of Palestine, and his response is to formally annex the illegally occupied West Bank, does that now mean, having recognized the state of Palestine, the UK is now obliged to impose sanctions because this is your stated goal, recognition of Palestine, Palestine exists, and you have to now defend that policy? Does that now not put a much higher pressure and burden on these countries to defend that policy if Netanyahu moves forward with annexation, as he has said a number of times he would?
Well, theoretically, yes, but you can think of this similarly to the way London and Berlin and Paris always sanctimoniously talk about human rights and the rule of law and transparency and all the rest of it. It's smoke and mirrors. The direction of travel, as far as these governments is concerned, is business as usual. That's why they've opted for recognition rather than meaningful and concrete policy changes. And they would like nothing better than to be able to continue with business as usual, and will find a way to finesse this if Israel backs them into a corner with its increasingly brazen declarations and policy. And what will determine this, if Israel goes ahead and annexes, yes, it will increase pressure on these governments to do something. They would prefer to, continue with their intelligence overflights, with their arms deliveries, with their massive trade relations, continue buying Israeli weapons and so on, and then perhaps sanction this or that settler or minister. The key ingredient in this equation is domestic public opinion. Will it be able to mobilize, and will it be able to exercise sufficient pressure on these governments that force them to go in directions that they do not want to? And there's ample evidence to believe that that could happen. Because if it couldn't, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because these governments had absolutely no intention of ever recognizing a Palestinian state unless Israel, which, as you mentioned, was never going to enable a Palestinian state unless Israel did so first. Now they've done so before there's even any prospect of negotiations. They've done so because they felt they had no choice but to capitulate to massive domestic public pressure. And of course, Israel and its apologists, this is all, they're trying to give this impression that all Muslims support Palestine, that it's only Muslims who support Palestine, that somehow other sectors of domestic public opinion couldn't give a hoot about this issue. Well, we've seen the demonstrations, we've seen the petitions, we've seen the pools, and so on. This is a national issue in each of these countries, and that explains the discussion we're having now.
Yeah, and so let's leave that for now and turn to another development, which is a proposal by, or alleged proposal by President Donald Trump um, for the day after in Gaza. He's having a meeting in New York on the side of the United Nations General Assembly meeting with a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan, where he will present the principles around which Israel will withdraw, and there will be ceasefire, and there will be an end to the genocide. So what do we know about this meeting, and what would those principles be? And I guess if many of these G7 countries now recognize the state of Palestine, uh, do you expect them to insist one of the principles would be that the state of Palestine would be Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel must remove its settlements? I doubt they will do that. But if we are thinking about talking about principles, that should be one of the principles that these states should be asserting, if that is their position.
Well, apparently the US now has yet another proposal for what's called day after scenario and has been developed, it seems, in close coordination with none other than the Right Honorable or former Right Honorable Tony Blair, Boston Consulting Group, various shady Israeli officials, and so on. And the way it is being presented is that the Arab states are called upon to send armed forces to the Gaza Strip to make it safe for Israel, to bear the financial burden of reconstruction, and that eventually the territory will be handed over to some form of Palestinian governance. But at the same time, we've also seen all these reports that the real purpose of this is to begin offering financial incentives to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to permanently leave under the guise of, leaving for a few years while the Gaza Strip is reconstructed, and so on. But the fundamental contradiction here is that all this talk of Mohammed bin Salman, artificial intelligence city, Elon Musk, electric battery factory, and so on. That's really all just cover, camouflage, smoke and mirrors, um, to cover the real intention, which is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip of its Palestinian population and to have it under permanent Israeli rule. That is the Israeli intention. They're saying so loudly and proudly 24 hours a day. The United States is basically on board with that. And against that, you have the Arab governments, who, on the one hand, couldn't care less about the Palestinians and what Israel does to them, but at the same time are mortified of this issue not being contained within the Gaza Strip. And therefore, they have made very clear that they will only get involved in a post war scenario, certainly if it requires them to provide troops and funding, only if it is part of a credible and irreversible process that leads to an end of Israeli occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state. So, at this meeting that's going to be held between these various Arab and Islamic leaders and the White House, the key issue is will Washington in any way take their priorities into consideration? And if it doesn't, will it be able to bully them into accepting the American Israeli plan for the Gaza Strip? My sense is that there's not going to be any resolution, and that, as with these ceasefire negotiations, their basic purpose is to provide a fig leaf for the continuation and intensification of the Gaza genocide, as we're seeing now with all these horrific scenes and coming out of Gaza City in particular.
Yes, and I think one of the major stumbling blocks would be the role of the PA. Israel has insisted that even the Palestinian Authority will not have any role in future government of Palestine. But Tony Blair's plan sees the formation of what is called the Gaza International Transitional Authority, GITA, which will temporarily govern Gaza and coordinate with the PA, and then give the PA authority, once it's satisfied the PA has made has undergone reform. So it does see a role, but of course Israel has insisted even the PA is a terrorist group, even the PA is not someone Israel is willing to see as a leader of the Palestinian country, Palestinian state. So that would be a major stumbling block, amongst others. Do you think?
Yes, and a certain number of demands will be made of the Palestinian Authority, and if and when it satisfies each of them to perfection, a new set of demands will be made, and so on. When you look at these demands, I think you have to have in your head the image of a hamster in a wheel, and the faster the hamster runs, the more it remains in the same place. And that's the way it's always been. Recognize Israel. Okay, Israel is recognized. Okay, recognize Israel's right to exist. Okay, recognize Israel's right to exist. Well, recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. And if that would happen, of course it won't, it shouldn't. If that should happen, then, recognize Damascus as an integral component of the Jewish state of Israel. And we've been through this so many times, with the Palestinian Authority, one reform after another, one institution after another. And every time the Palestinian Authority meets the criteria that have been set before it, and it has done so on numerous occasions, per the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and any number of other institutions. It's actually one of the most financially transparent entities on the planet, which is constantly being audited and so on. Once it meets whatever demands are made on it, we'll get a whole tsunami of new demands. The purpose is not to influence the structure or the content of the PA's conduct. The purpose is to make sure that the PA or any Palestinian body can ever become properly sovereign and independent in Palestine. And just getting back to the earlier part of our discussion, you can already see all the demands that are being made of the Palestinians in the context of recognition. I mean, normally, when one state recognizes another, it's simply recognizing it. It simply recognizes it. In this case, many of these countries are saying, the PA has to do this, Hamas has to be disarmed, Hamas cannot participate in the political process, all kinds of other demands and conditions. But they're basically recognize, even determining the national security policy of the future state by saying it has to be demilitarized and so on. They're basically seeking to recognize a paralyzed protectorate rather than a genuinely independent and sovereign state.
And obviously, it won't be a sovereign state in the sense that it will not have a military. Palestine will be demilitarized, and many other key aspects of a state will be denied to them. So that, I guess, goes without saying. Let's turn our attention to Gaza now. Last week, when we were recording our episode, the UN Commission published a report concluding that Israel's action in Gaza meets the threshold of genocide. We didn't really have much time to discuss that because it was literally a few minutes before we came on air, I think. But let's spend some time discussing that. So now we have another body which has looked at all aspects of Israel's campaign, from the manner in which it's conducting the war and also the expressed motivations of all the key individuals, and has concluded Israel is committing genocide. And this report comes on the back of another study by an organization. It's worth mentioning this study, an organization called Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. And they've concluded in their research that about 15 of every 16 Palestinians that have been killed since March are civilians. So the numbers of civilians killed can is is conclusive in to prove that there is a genocide taking place, and of course there is intent, and intent has been something which many of these organizations, the UN and various others, have been very forceful in demonstrating, and this report demonstrates that. And one example of showing intent is I thought this was really important to highlight the attack on the IVF clinics. Israel destroyed IVF clinics, embryos, sperm storage, and they interpreted this as targeting of Palestinian reproductive capacity and as another indication of the intent to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part. So that was an interesting example they cited, of course, amongst many other things. So just your thoughts on the UN Commission's findings and
Yeah.
conclusions.
Well, the Independent International Committee on, I think it's called, on Israeli Practices in the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel, a very prestigious body led by the renowned South African Navi Pillay, who was formerly the chairman of the International Tribunal on Rwanda, Chris Sidoti, a very well-known Australian human rights specialist and legal scholar, and a third well-known jurist and specialist from India, who collectively submitted their resignations recently. So this is their last report. Have now come out with a very detailed and very compelling report demonstrating once again that Israel is engaged in genocide. And I think the first observation needs to be made is they're not saying that they have finally reached the determination that Israel is perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. They're unambiguously, explicitly stating that it is their assessment that Israel has been conducting genocide since October of 2023. In other words, from the moment that this campaign began. Now, genocide basically consists of 5 acts, 5 categories of actions plus intent, and the commission uh, concluded that Israel is perpetrating 4 of these acts. The only one it isn't, the fifth one, is the forcible transfer of children from the protected group outside the territory. And the main reason it's not doing that is because it's killing them all, or killing them by the thousands. And as far as intent is concerned, the Commission's report demonstrates both the overwhelming number of statements by Israeli officials, political leaders, military leaders, and also says that intent can be inferred from, on the one hand, the conduct of Israeli forces on the ground. In other words, they are receiving these statements, they're translating them into action, and they're not being investigated, they're not being held accountable, they're not being prosecuted for any of these actions. To the contrary, they're being encouraged to conduct them. And and a main message of this report is that states have an obligation, because the Genocide Convention, which is being so clearly violated, calls upon states not only to punish genocide, but also to prevent it. And the Commission makes the point that there is absolutely no excuse for waiting until the International Court of Justice determines uh, that it is a genocide several years from now. In other words, the purpose of the convention is not just to hold people accountable for the corpses they've produced, but to hold them accountable so that no further corpses are produced. And this, of course, brings into play, the government policy national prosecutions, and so on. So it's an extremely important report. And of course, the Israeli response, which the commission member, Chris Sidoti, quite rightly described as a broken record, something that's generated by Chat GPT in various forms, invariably, whenever such reports appear. You know, Commission members know nothing about human rights. They know nothing about international law. They know nothing about genocide. They're anti Semites. The report is a blood libel, and all the rest of this hysterical ravings without actually taking issue with a single piece of evidence that is included in the report. So just all these ad hominem attacks trying to smear and delegitimize, shooting the
Well, they
messenger.
also go against their own propaganda as well. I mean, for example, at the beginning, Starmer, for example, the UK Prime Minister said that the determination for whether it's a genocide or not is for the ICJ, not
Yeah,
for us. And then a few months later, oh, they conducted their own investigation and they've concluded. It happens to be just a few days before Israel's president was visiting the UK. He concluded that no, we've concluded that Israel is not committing genocide. So how do you, on the one hand, say it's for the ICJ, and then on the
yeah,
other hand, say it's we've just determined that it's not? So they don't realize that they are going against their own propaganda lines.
precisely. Yeah. And what's interesting here, this letter by the former British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, it stated explicitly that, and in direct contradiction to the previous position that this is something for the ICJ to decide, as you mentioned, his letter explicitly stated not only that there is no genocide, but there is not even a threat of genocide. In other words, the idea that there's anything to prevent simply doesn't exist. And of course, this is the British government's way of insulating itself from any legal obligations and repercussions. But it was only days after he wrote this outrageous letter that the Independent International Commission produced its report.
Mm. Do you think, I mean, I didn't get to watch Trump's speech at the UN today, and there's a lot of frustration, I guess, within Washington and Israel over the UN for many reasons, of course. But do you think this is another reason now where they will say, to hell with the UN? We need to dismantle this organization. Israel, of course, would like nothing better to see a world where all the major global institutions are eroded or completely dismantled, and it becomes a war of all against all, state against states, and there is no rules-based order. And this is something Israel will, of course, love because it has its big brother is the US to defend Israel from any threats. So, do you think this would be another reason to, completely, I mean, go after the UN in a more aggressive manner?
Americans particularly, but Westerners generally, they love mocking um, uh, third world autocrats, as they call them, particularly if their skin is dark. They love mocking them for being these, what do you call it, ostentatious megalomaniacs and so on. But I have to say, in my decades of watching United Nations proceedings, I have never, and I will never, see a more cartoonish buffoon address the United Nations General Assembly than Donald Trump. It was really something for the ages. Find me a single African or Asian or Latin American dictator, including Milei, for that matter,
Italy.
who who even gets within a mile of Trump in being such a utterly vulgar, cartoonish buffoon. It will simply never happen. I listened to a good part of his address to the General Assembly today. It's out of this world. He basically spent half the time attacking his predecessor, Joe Biden, and talking about all his supposed achievements, that he stopped 7 wars and that he's eligible for the Nobel Peace Prize, and then began attacking the United Nations and many of its member states. And basically explicitly putting forward the great replacement theory that's a favorite among far right and neo fascists and so on. But he was attacking the UN so consistently. I was actually expecting and hoping that he would announce the withdrawal of the United States from the world body, but that hasn't happened, or at least hasn't happened yet. Yes, it will be music to Israel's ears, but the flip side of that is that it's also creating a dynamic where countries within Europe may eventually have to come to the conclusion that constantly submitting to a bully and constantly capitulating the way they have been is going to lead not to them securing their vital interests, but is going to lead to their self-destruction and suicide.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch the address today in the evening.
You
And
should,
let's yeah, let's turn our attention to another key development in the region, which was the Saudi-Pakistan Security Pact that was agreed last week. I think it was agreed a day after the summit, which we discussed in the last episode as well. So this seems to be another indication that the region from the attack on Doha by Israel is recalculating its threats and seeking other options. And I think there's of course recognition that even America cannot rein in its ally Israel, Netanyahu, even though there were reports in the Washington Wall Street Journal last week where Trump apparently is really frustrated with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he apparently used the F word in describing his relationship with Netanyahu, and he's been effed up by Netanyahu, things like that. But if you're the superpower, then if you're this angry, then you expect to be able to impose your will on your junior partner, but it doesn't seems to be happening. So Arab countries have probably come to the conclusion that Israel is gone rogue and there is no way of restraining Israel, and we need to find other alternatives. And Saudi seems to be the first country that's made a decision, and the decision is to have a security pact with Pakistan. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting development. I think, as you suggested, Israel's bombing of Doha really was a game changer for many of these governments because, it basically shows two things. That Israel is no longer directing its fire only at real or perceived enemies, whether in Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran. Am I leaving anyone out? Um,
Scenario.
but also feels fully emboldened to attack neutral states, states that are actually cooperating with it at its request in terms of these interminable ceasefire negotiations. But more importantly, are doing so with the authorization of the superpower that presents itself as a guarantor of their security and stability. Because, of course, this attack could not have happened without a US green light. And just as importantly, the US did absolutely nothing afterwards to punish Israel for doing so. So these governments feel completely exposed. Borders are meaningless. U.S. protection is meaningless. The only thing that means anything is Israel's determination to do whenever it pleases, however it pleases, wherever it pleases, and to do so with either open U.S. support or tacit U.S. approval. Now, these governments have been engaged in a process of strategic diversification for some time. So this is hardly a revolutionary development as such. But what we saw at the emergency Doha summit of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation last week was that the governments were not interested in adopting any kind of collective security response. And this Saudi Pakistani agreement basically shows that states prefer to deal with these issues bilaterally on their own terms. Now, the Saudi Pakistani relationship goes back decades. There have been numerous reports that Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was, in fact, covertly financed by the Saudis. And that part of this arrangement was that if there is ever an existential threat to Saudi Arabia, it will be able to rely on Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. But we now have something much broader, which is a mutual defense treaty, mutual meaning that any country that attacks either Saudi Arabia or Pakistan will be confronted with the military resources of the other. How this will play out in practice is, of course, an entirely different matter and remains to be seen. But I do think, it does serve as a warning signal, not only to Israel, because I think it is anticipating increasingly rogue Israeli behavior in the months and years to come, but it's also, I think, a warning shot to the United States that, um, we're your client state because you pledged to defend us. But if you're now going to let your rabid attack dog attack us as well, well, then we do have alternatives to defend ourselves, and we may need to spend our billions that we're committing to our defense, not only in the United States. And if I may, there's also another development, which is that Egypt has come up with.
Yeah, I was just going to ask
Yeah,
you about that.
please. Yeah.
Egypt apparently presented a NATO-style defense pact, Arab NATO-style defense pact, and it was rejected partly because Egypt wanted to lead that effort, but Saudi Arabia rejected the idea. And the day after, Saudi Arabia signed that defense pact
Yeah.
with Pakistan. So it seems like, I mean, one would expect that you'll get to a situation where the Middle Eastern countries will recognize that they need a pact of their own, which could include nuclear armed Pakistan. Nuclear armed Pakistan with the Arab and the Gulf states. That seems like the most logical thing to do, and present that as your solution to Israel's on colonial expansion and bombing of 7, 8 countries within the space of a few months.
Yeah, I think, several issues are at play here. First of all, as we already saw in Doha, these governments do not like to engage in collective agreements in which they commit themselves to defending any number of foreign states, and they prefer to deal with these issues bilaterally rather than multilaterally. And then, of course, there's also the issue of Saudi Egyptian competition for leadership of the Arab world. It's often forgotten, that Egypt, in many respects, with the possible exception of Morocco, is the only genuine nation state in the Arab world, and has been a leader of the Arab world for many decades. Well, that it has now become basically a dependency of states much smaller than itself, and it seems that it is making some efforts to reassert its regional leadership role. And Saudi Arabia, which has been the dominant power in the Arab world now for quite some time, is seeking to preserve its role. And I think that also helps explain why it shot down this Egyptian proposal.
Mm. And Saudi Arabia also is said to be expanding economic and security cooperation with Iran. So there's news stories about that as well. I
Yes,
think,
if I could just make one
go
more
on,
observation
Carol,
about
sure.
Egypt. We've seen these reports that Egypt is deploying unprecedented numbers of heavy military equipment and so on in the Sinai Peninsula in violation of the 1979 peace treaty with Israel. Others have suggested this is all just made up fantasy by Israel, and that the most important violation of that peace agreement is actually Israel's deployment of heavy weaponry on the Gaza side of the border, and Sisi referring to Israel as an enemy at the Doha summit, and now also releasing one of the most noted political prisoners in Egypt, Ala Abdel Fattah, who was released just yesterday, Monday, from Egypt's dungeons, where he'd spent, I think, in excess of a decade. Um, it does show that Egypt, like the rest of the region, is increasingly viewing Israel less as a valued security partner and more as a rogue regional arsonist. But having said that, I mean, the idea that Egypt is gearing up for a confrontation with Israel is complete hogwash. I mean, it just signed a 35 billion energy agreement, $35 billion energy agreement with Israel. Egypt is totally dependent on Israel and the United States. It couldn't fight a war for more than 6 hours without resupply from the United States, even as it has been gradually expanding
Mm.
its weapons purchases from Russia and to a lesser extent China. But we need to understand these are regimes that are, to put it a little simplistically, created by and thoroughly beholden to Washington, and the idea that they would act in the national interest rather than the interests of others is I think, at this stage at least, a pipe dream.
Yeah, before we end up, I want to end with a question about the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. I think many of us probably forgot about that. And this was an initiative that was presented before the Gaza genocide, and it was presented in a very gloating way, pro-Israelis, and I think Netanyahu himself presented this as, look what we are doing. We are bringing together India, Middle East, and Europe, and Palestine is nowhere there to be seen. Palestine is going to be forgotten. This is what we are doing. But looking at the situation now, 2 years on, um, Saudi Arabia is signing security pacts with Pakistan. It's getting closer and closer to Iran. UAE is threatening to, move away from the Abraham Accords, or say, the Abraham Accords, if Israel annexes, we will have to re-question our
It's a
commitment to
red
the.
line.
It's a red line, basically. So all these machinations taking place, and we've spoken about. So this plan with India, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Europe, it seems to be a pipe dream at the moment. So this was kind of presented as a major shift to challenge the China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now this seems like, with all the changes and developments over the past 2 years, seems like there's no way this project will
Yeah.
take shape.
I mean, it's an open question whether even without these developments, if it was ever a serious competitor of the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, this truck, train, road, train, port. It never really made sense to begin with, except as a Herculean effort to try to present an alternative to a much more logical and much more efficient Chinese project, the Belt and Road Initiative. But yeah, now if absent that, if these Arab governments ever grow a spine, you know, Saudi Arabia can end overflight rights over its airspace for flights originating or heading towards Israel. It can ensure that such traffic does not have access to its territory. The UAE, if it puts its money where its mouth is, which is, of course, an open question, will no longer be a partner in this as well. So, to the extent that IMEC was ever a serious initiative I think we can conclude that it's in its death throes.
No, I raised it because it was presented by the Israelis to gloat and
Yes,
say to the Palestinians, "You don't matter."
yes.
The world has
Well,
forgotten you.
that was its
We've
real
moved on.
purpose.
That was
Yeah.
its real purpose, and now this is everyone's forgotten about IMEC. We just
Yeah.
want to reiterate at that point.
Yeah.
Okay, Monia. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll t- come together again next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. And thank you everyone who's tuned in. And do remember to like and share our podcast. And see you again next week. Bye bye.